This is the last Sunday of the month, the last Sunday of the year, the last Sunday of the decade. So this is a time of year that we typically create New Year's resolutions. Anybody here made a New Year's resolution this year? Anyone made a resolution not to make resolutions? Oh, you kind of blew it already. All right, so, this is the time of year that we always make promises to ourselves. I am going to exercise more. I'm going to eat better. I'm going to spend more time with the kids. I'm going to read more books. And so it becomes a time where we sort of look back on our inability to be disciplined in the past, and we make a decision about the future. Of course, oftentimes we get to about, January 15th, and we realize that our determination maybe hasn't been enough to carry us through, and things maybe aren't going as they should be. So New Year's is the time that we look back and we think about what's happened in our past year, and it's the time when we look forward and think about what's going on in this new year. And maybe as you look back at this past year, or maybe you're looking back at this past decade, and you think about all the things that God has blessed you with. If I think back to 10 years ago, I didn't have any children. I guess I was living in Korea at the time. And life was very, very different than it is right now. I didn't anticipate being a pastor at that point in time. If I look back on the last year, I've experienced quite a bit of a change with my family and myself moving up here. So we look back, and if you happen to look back at this last year, this last decade, and you see God's blessing and his hand of favor with you, then we rejoice with you and say, God bless, and that's wonderful. But that's not always how we experience things when we look back, is it? There are times when we look back and we find ourselves asking the same question that David asked at the beginning of Psalm 22, and that Jesus echoes on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Perhaps this year you've encountered struggles that you didn't anticipate, hardships, disappointments. And it's hard to understand how God has been faithful in the midst of that situation. Well, this morning I want to look at God's faithfulness and the shapes that it takes. And there's a lot of different stories that I could use to do that, but I'm going to go to the story of Joseph. Old Testament Joseph, not New Testament Joseph. Now, the story's kind of long. It's the last 13 chapters of Genesis. So I'm going to summarize, or else this is going to be a really long sermon. And then I'm just going to read a little bit of scripture at the end of the story, and then I'm going to do some reflections on it. So Joseph's story. Joseph, of course, is the 11th son and the favorite son of Jacob, also known as Israel. And so Joseph, at an early age, senses that God is calling him to a position of leadership. He has these dreams. And because he's young and immature and probably a little cocky, he decides that he needs to share those dreams with his brothers and with his parents. And the dreams obviously point to them serving him. And it goes over great because they're all patient and wonderful people, and they just say, okay, Joseph, you'll learn. Oh, no, that's not how it goes, is it? Oh, no, they plan to kill him. So anyways, yes, they don't like him very much. He's got these dreams. He's also got a fancy coat that Dad gave him because he's the favorite. And so they plot to kill him. And at the last minute, they have a change in heart, but instead of killing him, they just sell him into slavery. So he goes down to Egypt and is sold into slavery. Well, they fake his death and cover it up with Dad. So Joseph finds himself as a slave in the house of a guy named Potiphar. And here he learns humility. And he learns to work hard, and suddenly God is with him, and he does well, and everybody gets put over everything in Pharaoh's house. But Pharaoh's wife, or not Pharaoh, I should say, Potiphar's wife notices him and tries to seduce him. And he remains faithful and flees the temptation, but is accused of attempting to rape her. And so he ends up in prison. And right about this time, I think he's probably echoing the cry that David is going to have, and several hundred more years where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He ends up in prison for trying to do the right thing. And while he's in prison, he continues this pattern of working hard and trying to have integrity. And eventually he interprets the dream of the royal cupbearer saying that he was going to be reinstated. And he says, hey, remember me when you go back to Pharaoh. And he says, totally will. And then he goes back to Pharaoh and completely forgets about Joseph. Then a few years more pass, and then Pharaoh has some disturbing dreams and is trying to figure out what's going on. And he mentions it to the cupbearer, and the cupbearer's like, hey, I know a guy. And so they bring Joseph in, and Joseph interprets the dreams. He says, oh, what's going to happen is that there's going to be 7 years with a bumper crop, and then there are going to be 7 years of famine. And you better save up now. Put somebody in charge of it so that they can take the surplus right now so that there's something left in the years where there's no food. And Pharaoh says, you sound like the kind of guy who can do that. So Joseph goes from being a prisoner to being the second in command of all of Egypt. And then eventually this famine starts, and Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to buy grain because it's spread to Canaan where they live as well. And this is where Joseph has the opportunity to get revenge on them. And he does start by playing some pretty nasty head games with them. But eventually, he decides not to take any sort of revenge on them, and instead, he basically forgives them. And so, picking up in Genesis chapter 45, verses 4 to 8, he says, his brothers are there, and he says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for sending me to this place. It was God who sent me here, ahead of you, to preserve your lives. This famine has ravaged the land for 2 years, and will last for 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all of Egypt. So eventually, Jacob comes to live in Egypt. There's a great family reunion, but the brothers are still a little bit skeptical. They think that Joseph might be pulling a Michael Corleone and is waiting for dad to pass away before he exacts his revenge. And so after Jacob dies, Joseph reassures his brothers and says, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You were intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. Now, what do we learn from Joseph's story? Well, I think that there are a few different lessons that we can sort of draw out of this. The first is that God has a plan. God is not reactive the way that you or I are reactive. Something happens and we say, oh gosh, how do I respond to this? Rather, God anticipates what's going to happen and has got the pieces in movement before the need arises. He knows this famine is going to come, and so he positions Joseph where Joseph needs to be in order to enact this rescue plan for his people. And so we know that nothing surprises God, which is comforting, I think, because when life is unexpected, as it often is for us, we know that this isn't catching God unaware, and that God is not scratching his head going, oh gosh, how do I fix this problem? But that God is already at work fixing the problem right now. I think the second lesson that we learn, and this is sort of related to it, is that God's plan is not endangered by my failures or by evil that's done to me. If you think about it, why did Joseph's brothers send him to the land of Egypt? They did it because they hated him. They just wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to humiliate him and turn him from daddy's favorite son into somebody's slave. But the fact that this was done in violation of what we would say is godly behavior does not mean that this somehow falls outside of God's plan. God is able to use Joseph's brothers' evil intentions in order to bring about his plan. This brings up the question about whether or not God is the one who causes people to do bad things. Did God make Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery? Is he ultimately responsible for the bad things that happened to them? Well, I'd say the answer is no. God does not cause us to do bad things. Rather, God allows us to do the bad things because he can use them in his plan. God has given us free will. We actually get to choose what we do. But God is so resourceful, so all-knowing, that he can use even our bad intentions and the evil things that happen to us. And he can use those in this unfolding plan by which he is going to reconcile all of creation to himself. So God has a plan, and that plan is not put into jeopardy by our failure or by evil. The third thing, I think, is that God's plan takes time to fulfill. And that when it takes time, that's not an indication that God is being faithless. So Joseph is 17 years old when he's sold into slavery. And he's 30 years old when Pharaoh sets him up as the governor of Egypt. So he is a slave or a prisoner for 13 years. And I think you can imagine that about 12 and a half years into this whole thing, he could be sitting here feeling sorry for himself, saying, God, I've tried to be a good person. I've tried to exercise integrity and wisdom in everything that I've done. And maybe I was a little cocky as a kid, but I got sold into slavery. I got framed for trying to rape my master's wife. I get sent to prison, and I get forgotten about here. Where are you in the midst of this? How can a just God allow this to happen to me? But then, he gets a call from Pharaoh. And suddenly, everything becomes clear. He understands that this happened for a reason. And we're blessed. Sometimes God will allow us to see why we have walked through difficult times. Sometimes we don't get to see that. Abraham is given promises by God. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give your people this land that you're on. So he was just living in a tent in the land of Canaan at the time. And I'm going to bless all the families of the world through you. That's in 2000 BC. It's another 400 or 500 years before he makes Abraham's descendants into a great nation with this Exodus. And and then brings them into this land. And then God promises to bless all the nations through his offspring. And that offspring is Jesus Christ. So we're going ahead 2,000 years before this offspring who's going to bless all the nations shows up. And guess what? It's still unfolding. There are many nations that have been blessed by Jesus, but not all of them yet have been. And so God's plan here, he announced it to Abraham 4,000 years ago, and it's still ongoing. But we can see God at work in history, in the world, bringing it to completion. But God doesn't answer to us in terms of a timetable. He has timing in his mind, and frankly, he doesn't answer to us, and his timetable is kind of unscrutable to us. And so we have to learn to just trust that he's doing what he's doing, and that he will bring it to completion, even if we aren't the ones who see that ever happening. The Israelites were enslaved for 400 years before they were delivered from the land of Egypt. And I imagine the people who lived in the middle of that lived their entire lives in slavery, wondering where God was. Well, God was at work, even though they never lived to see it. So I think the fourth lesson that we can learn, so first was God has a plan. Second was God's plan is not endangered by evil. The third is that God's plan takes time to fulfill, and its lack of fulfillment in a timely manner does not mean that he's not at work. And the fourth is that our suffering has a redemptive purpose. So in the case of Joseph, what's the kind of person who teases his brothers about these dreams that he has, that he's going to rule over them? Joseph shows a lack of integrity, or at least a lack of humility, that's going to be an absolutely essential requirement for him to fulfill God's purposes for him. And so, as he walks through this humbling experience of being sold into slavery, being framed for a crime, being a prisoner, he learns some of those skills that he's going to need in order to be a faithful follower of God and a person who is faithful to the plan that God has for him. You know, when we think about our own experiences, if you think back, how do I respond to some sort of a trouble today? And how would I have responded to that 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? And I hope that we can say, the me today is wiser than the me of my younger years. And that if I was presented with the same quandary today as I was back then, or that maybe I know that I am going to make a better decision now than I would have then. And that is God at work in us through the circumstances that we face, oftentimes the difficult circumstances that we face, refining our character and helping to make us more like Jesus. As James, Jesus' brother, writes, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when faith is tested, your endurance will have a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing." But sometimes we have become mature in an area and we still experience difficulty. We still experience hardship. Does that mean that God is being unfaithful to us? No. What it does, though, is it can shape our character and make us more godly. But in the places where we have become like Jesus, difficulty, hardship, and sacrifice allow us to reveal God's character to the people around us. Paul is a great example of this. He very quickly becomes a mature Christian, and he becomes, the great apostle of the early church. And writing to the Corinthian church, he's talking about the apostles and the way that they suffer, because there are people in the Corinthian church who are saying, "Oh, Paul can't possibly be a servant of God. Look at how hard things are for him. God's trying to say, hey, buddy, you're doing it all wrong." So they say, basically, things would go easy for him if he were serving God, and Paul refutes this because he sees his sufferings as an extension of the sufferings of Jesus. Writing about him and his fellow apostles, he say, "In everything we do, we show that we are true ministers of God. We patiently endure troubles and hardships and calamities of every kind. We've been beaten, been put in prison, faced angry mobs, worked to exhaustion, endured sleepless nights, and gone without food. We prove ourselves by our purity, our understanding, our patience, our kindness, by the Holy Spirit within us, and by our sincere love. We faithfully preach the truth. God's power is working in us." And so even those who have become mature experience suffering and disappointment and heartache, because in doing so and in responding in a godly way, we demonstrate to the world who God is. You see, your life may be the only portrait of God that the world sees. And people have a lot of preconceived notions about God. They think that he is angry. They think that he has a desperate need to be right. They think that he's a cosmic killjoy. They think lots of things about him. But when I respond to suffering, hardship, or I sacrifice on behalf of others from love, then I call those things and those misconceptions about God into question in people's lives. And they can see God at work in me, and I become a living love letter of God to those who are lost. And I become an expression of God's faithful character. So as we look back on this year that we have just come through, or this decade that we've just come through, and we look forward, wherever we find ourselves, we serve a faithful God. If God's hand is evident in your life right now, we celebrate with you, and we hope that you will have a revelation of his love and goodness towards you. And if you find yourself in the place where you don't see God's hand of faithfulness with you, we stand with you in prayer that you will be able to faithfully endure this moment, because we know that God is faithful, and that when the accounts of history are all settled and the tallies are all taken and God has brought everything to its conclusion, that he will be proved faithful. Even if at this moment in time we find ourselves like Joseph, 12 and a half years into his ordeal, asking, where is God in the middle of all of this? And so I ask and pray that you would have faith to see God at work, even if you never quite understand why you're going through the situation in which you're going through. Let's pray.